Well, I hope that you all had a chance to calm and reset your minds after yesterday impressions. And now we are going further with our conference. And I have the pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Katerina Kolozova. She's director of the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje, and also professor at the same institute as well, at the Institute and the University American College in Skopje too, and visiting professor on several Southeastern colleges as well, visiting professor in Arizona. Author also of several books published in Macedonia and abroad. And today, the title of her lecture is a theme revisited too many times, Antigone, Kinship, and State. Good morning, Katerina. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks, Natasha, for the introduction. If I may just correct you at one point, actually, I've published only 2 books in Macedonian, and they both have to do something with antiquity, with ancient Greek philosophy and tragedy. That ended in the early 2000s. Since then, I've been publishing mainly in the UK and US and primarily contemporary philosophy. So this makes the return to an academic context of my alma mater, and also to the topic of tragedy and myth and drama, like a homecoming. So it feels good for that reason. I'm sorry, I'm not there right now. I'm spending this year abroad. So we have to do it via Zoom while you sit in the conference hall where I defended my thesis. So it's just a lovely context. Anyways, in spite of my departure from classics, as I mentioned, I've always revisited topics and argumentation that stems from this area of studies, which includes Greek drama, tragedy, myth, and of course philosophy, because this is my primary background, ancient Greek philosophy. And the topic of my defense, by the way, talking about my background, was of course was concepts of death in ancient Greece, both in religion, culture, and philosophy. So, as you may imagine, the theme of tragedy features strongly there. So, talking about these links and constant revisiting of Greek tragedy in whatever I do now, which is not classics Greek philosophy properly in the proper narrow sense of the word, but more contemporary debates in non-philosophical, epistemological debates, philosophy, where I take the track of Orwellian non-philosophy, then combining it with Marx, and of course always revisiting feminist philosophy. My backdrop being Lise Irigaray primarily currently, as you may guess from the abstract. So I am approaching the question from this vantage point. I've published several works where I engage in what I want to consider a constructive dialogue or challenging of some of Judith Butler's thesis, especially because this is a conversation that started during my postdoc at Berkeley, where they was my supervisor back then. And some of those conversations remain unfinished. So I will propose the following argument to discuss here. Judith Butler's Antigone's claim, the book that was published in early 2000s, I believe, has played a major role in conceiving, first of all, theoretically, academically, and then activistically or politically, in conceiving the discourse that would allow for first academic and then also policy or political argumentation for the inclusion of the gendered and marginals or the sexual minorities within the norm, within the symbolic order. As you may remember, the strategy Butler proposes by following Foucault is that we affirm the ruling symbolic order, we affirm the ruling asymmetries of power or laws and structure of power within the dominant discourses of a society, and then within this framework or world view that has already been affirmed, and we are well aware that it is a patriarchal one, we create pockets, niches of resistance. Resistance actually, and the resistance is, as Butler formulates in Psychic Life of Power, the resistance consists in assuming the position of the subject, because you cannot get out of the conditioning, you cannot defy the conditioning, almost deterministic to a degree, to a considerable degree, deterministic conditioning in the vein of Foucault of what a subject, including a gendered subject, could be. So the only form of resistance that is proposed there is subversion, while assuming the subject position produced by the context of the ruling discourse, we are actually, through acts of performance that are also in the sense of performativity, we act the role assigned to us by the society, we expose the moment of performance there, the moment of constructedness, and via that we subvert the norm, gradually eroding the norm in order to create niches or space for destabilizing the asymmetries of power within the given discourse. So that's Butler's setup. Now let's go back to the book Antigone's Claim and how the figure of Antigone is used to push forward this argument. So I just explained the epistemological standpoint of Butler, where they departs from, and then we arrive at Antigone's Claim, where Antigone becomes the figure of how we might imagine this emancipation within a symbolic order which is inherently, unavoidably patriarchal. And it cannot be anything else. And this is not something that a Butler would deny or denies in Antigone's Claim. So I see three problems, three fallacies that are in Butler's approach that are epistemological and draw political consequences, I would say. The first problem is this. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay.
It's okay.
The first is this approach to the topics of classics of Greek antiquity, or whatever term you prefer, let's call it classical antiquity, without any consideration of how the specialists of classics discuss these issues, that you choose in order to create your own metaphors, essentially, to create an argument. So what Butler does, so this is the second reproach, what Butler does is appropriates Hegel, who already commits the error of reading Sophocles and the tragedy of Antigone in his own system, according to his own system, according to the concept of law and state as conceived within his, be it idealist, yet again, modern concept of state. So this is the first error of anachronism and kind of one would nowadays call it a cultural appropriation in a way, even though in some not so typical way or reverse way, because you just take up this story and you try to fit it within a framework of thinking which is just not applicable to the era you're discussing. So that is the second error that Butler also commits, including conceptual and terminological aberrations. Butler commits there in the discussion, but so does Hegel. And I will explain which ones. And in the end, we we end up both with epistemic, scientific, call them scientific or theoretical fallacies in thought, because there are all of these hybridizations without examination of the foundation of the hybridization of thought, which I just spoke about. So there is this error, which then produces the political error. The political error is, at least in the consequences of Butler's reading of Antigone via Hegel, is reinforcing an authoritarian concept of state, because Hegel's concept of state is plainly, openly, and no one would deny it. Even the most Hegelian of the Hegelians is authoritarian. Even the mention of the individual within his notion of statehood is a cloak that serves the universal being objectified, concretized, the concrete universal within the state with capital S. So we've got this notion of state. Butler does not submit it to any kind of critique in Antigone's claim. Yeah. Yeah, I will unmute myself. Okay. Okay. So there is no examination of this. There is no challenge of this. There is some slight critique there that kinship, that Hegel makes the error of failing to affirm that her Antigone's fidelity, let's say, to the values of kinship is in fact political. If it is political, if it is a political act, so you already see, this inappropriate appropriation or projection of something contemporary onto antiquity, which wasn't individualistic. Just a slight digression. Svetlana, whom I can proudly say was my PhD supervisor, along with Jean-Pierre Vernant, for PhD thesis on around precisely these topics, more or less, in a collaboration within a collaboration with the Institute of Social Institutum Studiorum Humanitatis, and Kolozova did a second PhD that I worked in parallel with the one I defended in Skopje. And in a way that was included generously, that work with Svetlana and Vernant was included generously in the Skopje thesis, and both Svetlana and my Skopje supervisor met in Skopje while I was working on the thesis. So I can say that, it did have some fruition, this supervision. So going back to her mention of Vernant yesterday, I will reaffirm Vernant's insistence that you can think antiquity within and on its own terms. You cannot twist it to correspond automatically, almost reflect your views from your era, your contemporary. That might come from his Marxist background, historical materialism. For him, historical context was key. So anyway, the following is the main thesis here. Vernant has a couple of papers and books. I have no time to quote them now, insisting that subjectivity as, like the single the single individual in the autonomy in Kantian sense, in a way, did not exist. The solitary individual with the autonomy of the Kantian absolutely individualistic subject did not exist in antiquity. In antiquity, subjectivity was always collective, even if individualized or individuated. It is part of a certain collective continuum, a state, a community, whatever. But that was subjectivity in antiquity. So, going back to Butler and the appropriation of Antigone. Antigone could not have represented the principle personal is political, as Butler seems to hint at in Antigone's claim, by insisting that her speech was political. Therefore, is political, therefore, something of the state, something of the law, something that should be inscribed in the law of the state. And they challenges Hegel on these terms. But I would completely decenter the discussion. As you can infer from my intro, the consequences are, the political consequences are clear. We create forms of norms and normalization within a system within a symbolic order, as Lacan would put it, let's use a Lacanian term, that is inherently patriarchal. Within that, we create niches for emancipation for all sorts of gendered minorities. So we are reaffirming the structure, even though making it more malleable and more inclusive. But that structure, which includes, is inherently patriarchal. So we are coming to Irigary's conclusion that language, in this Lacanian sense, being masculine and being patriarchal, cannot allow for space or possibility for proper emancipation of women. We have to look for expressions outside language, even from the despised territory, despised by language and by rational reason and by Western philosophy, beginning with Plato and even before that, which is the territory of the bodily, the physical, this chora that mentioned in Timaeus, that can be just inseminated, but as just passivity without agency. Well, Irigaray says, okay, fine, because we are chora and you completely control language, well, let's emancipate chora. So when Butler mentions the role of the bodily that Irigaray ascribes to Antigone when defending kinship, the burial of her brother, she is affirming Irigaray in the sense of espousing at the time a feminist stance that was en vogue, which was basically accounting for bodily experience of the subjugated, and it ends there. So where is the complete misunderstanding, and how can we put the lens of Aristotle and the reconstructed context of antiquity, as we could have learned from Jean-Pierre Vernant, from especially Nicole Leroux. I'm basing this reading primarily on Nicole Leroux, whom I have discovered precisely thanks to my former supervisor, Svetlana Slapshek. So I'm kind of decentering or centering the lens from this perspective of a reconstructed. It cannot be authenticity, because we cannot vouch for authenticity about the ancient context, but sort of fidelity to its own terms that are reconstrued through some sort of an archaeological reading of antiquity. So we can start from trusting, believing the ancients when they say what their rules of the tragedy are. We can start from Aristotle, first and foremost. Even if one does not reject the thesis of catharsis as key to tragedy, even if one does not espouse fully the reading of Mikhail Petrushevsky of Aristotle's Poetics, still Petrushevsky's analysis and papers and notes in the translation point sufficiently to the fact that systasis ton pragmaton, the composition of elements or of deeds, is a key thing in every tragedy. leaving aside the definition, which contains the word catharsis, moving on through the poetics, we will find 10, 11 more places in Aristotle's Poetics where Aristotle insists that it's all about the composition of deeds, which enables drama, in the sense of drama, to do things that produce effects, centered around the problem of hamartema, or error, the tragical error, or tragic error, so it's all about that, and characters, I don't know, language, etc., are merely ornamental in a tragedy. This is Aristotle's position. If we take this position, and if we agree that the composition of deeds is around the act of hamartema, which is the error that anyone can commit by unknowingly being basically moved by challenging the immortals, so committing hybris, like being immortal but acting as if immortal, and we can all slip into this. Take Oedipus. He just can't stop digging about his past. And this desire for absolute truth about his origin is what drives him into hamartema. So we can all be tempted by that. There is no some primordial sin there that makes us hybrists. We can all become hybrists, but we have to know how. And Greek tragedy teaches us how. So going back to Aristotle's thesis, looking at the pragmata that are there in Antigone, the play by Sophocles, we can see the following moment. I mean, one can wonder who the hybrist is there. But I think that Tiresias, the seer, who appears also in Oedipus Rex, and who basically forebodes, by definition, the error and the fall into tragical decline, fall to tragical error and then misery. Tiresias appears in Antigone, and just as he proclaims to Oedipus that the more he digs, the more he basically provokes the gods, and will fall into a tragic error that could be avoided, because you don't have to know everything about yourself, about your origin. As a mere mortal, you should accept to live with a certain absence of knowledge about yourself. It's the search for absoluteness and search for the origins that maybe should never be touched, never be looked at. It's just beyond us. So this is also something typical of something not typical but marking Greek tragedy. It speaks of unspeakable, unimaginable deeds, but never represents them. It sends the message that they are not to be represented. So in the same sense, Tiresias stops Oedipus unsuccessfully. But in Antigone, if you remember, he has a conversation with Creon, and he starts to stop Creon from committing a crime that can drive him into this tragic madness, error, and then fall through hybris. But here, the claim that he is provoking and disrespecting the gods is clear. how is respecting the gods? So, going back to Hegel and Butler, Creon insists that Antigone should have respected the laws of the state. Antigone insists that she should have respected the divine laws. What Butler erroneously calls kinship. The private sphere and that, by the way, the kinship or family.
Here. Can you repeat this last thing you said?
Sorry?
We lost the last thing you said.
About kinship.
Yeah.
Okay. So there, Butler insists that by defending kinship, Antigone is performing a political act, and therefore she can be inscribed in Hegel's state. So she's correcting Hegel there. I'm repeating myself, recapping in order to show you the asymmetry between Tiresias and what would be an Aristotelian reading and Butler's Hegel's reading of this situation. So first of all, Butler's reading of Hegel is the following. They are making the distinction between kinship and civil society, or kinship, family, civil society, and state, on the other hand. Whereas Hegel speaks only of the state, and family is part of civil society and the private sphere, which could be and should be emancipated only through state. So this is one error, and this is how Butler's correction of Hegel is inapplicable. That's one mistake. Now let's juxtapose it to how Tiresias approaches it, how Sophocles basically spelled it out, and what would be in line with an Aristotelian reading of the tragedy. So Tiresias, the seer who speaks on behalf of the gods always, is warning Creon, just as he warned Oedipus that he will commit a crime against the gods and laws of the gods. So now we are going back to correcting Butler and Hegel, and in the terms of Antigone, Sophocles himself. Antigone says, I'm not breaking any laws. I am actually respecting the ancient divine laws. Your law of the state is something ephemeral, something changeable, something that can be subjected to decay because it's of human making. Well, Hegel does not see that. Hegel, having expelled God or the gods, to him, the state is a materialization. What am I saying? A objectivization, concretization of the universal idea of statehood, or actually the idea, mind. The mind as to how a society should be organized. It's just mind in general. So whatever would have been divine gods in Greek antiquity, in Hegel's state is merged with this statehood that Antigone calls ephemeral, of human making. So Hegel is already inapplicable here because the two terms are engulfed. The ideal or the idea, the idealist component of understanding state and statehood, and statehood itself as a phenomenon of human making. So there is already a different form of state he speaks of. So it's inapplicable on Antigone. So in this way, we are kind of dismissing Hegel, and with that, Butler's interpretation of Hegel becomes problematic. So she says, and Tiresias agrees with Antigone. She is defending the divine law. Opposed to the divine law is the human law, or statehood, or the laws of a state. Creon represents this one, Antigone represents the other one. Now, there is something disturbing about the types of divine laws that Antigone defends here.
Sorry,
They are of the Chthonic order.
we also lost the last
The last sentence.
Yeah, 2 or 3 sentences.
The last sentence. So law, which is opposed to the material, of human making laws and statehood that Hegel speaks of, or Creon speaks of, for that matter. The divine law that Antigone is no, the defense is done in a manner which is considered too radical, and I will explain why. Being so devoted to the rites like ritual, in that sense, obituary, the rites of the dead, and rights also of the dead, and death being linked to the chthonic dimension of everything divine is in a way being linked to the maternal era of divine laws and the rule of feminine divinities who have, like Moirai, Kerai, the Erinyes, the Furies in Eumenides, they're all somehow linked with sin, with sin against family committing crime against the bloodline. They're linked with the right of the dead and death as a principle. Antigone is devoted to this, it seems. So she kind of stands out through this, because this becomes problematic in the classical era, or in an imagined history, in an imagined time. It becomes problematic when the Olympians finally take over full power and control of the divine, putting under control the old dynasties of divinities, which takes place Achilles Eumenides, if you remember. But there, the Erinyes, and I'm talking about Eumenides, the Erinyes that persecute Orestes for his matricide are appeased and are somehow integrated into this rational law of the Olympians, where this infinitely bitter revolt that is typical of these feminine divinities that persecute the criminal, or the one who has committed an offense, with endless bitter revolt, a combination of grief and revolt, menace, as Nicole Leroux, and precisely the menace of Achilles from, it's just endless. It's endless. Like Demetrius' grief for Persephone. It's just this endless menace. So the grieving is also endless. It's just too dark, too infinite under control. This happens on the level of divine laws and their reconciliation or the compromise that takes place through the case of Orestes. But it is just a reflection of, particularly, especially in classical Athens, when we see restrictions of female expression of grief, female expression of lamentation. Svetlana mentioned the lamentation as something that has been persevering to this day, which is true. There is a fantastic book by Margaret Alexiou on this. But going back to what was problematic yet legitimate. So this excessiveness of lamentation, this excessiveness or endlessness of grief that had to be put under certain restraint from Solon onwards. This excessiveness in Antigone is, now we can maybe speculate that that is something that has an element of something hybristic, because it just goes too much on the side of from the maternal, that Sophocles did not like that, because he just simply says through Tiresias and through Antigone's own statements that this is just the divine laws that she defends. And the divine laws, after the compromise that I was just describing, do include the chthonic deities, the rights of the rights of the dead, and the necessity of the right to attend to a dead body and give it a proper burial. So this is more of a metaphysical problem that can be, with the help of Irigare and her emancipation of the Cora, etc., kind of transposed onto the field of feminist discussions, debates, at least around this space of Cora, or the symbolic that somehow evades the symbolic order and the domination of masculinity and patriarchy of language. And through that, envisage a sort of other strategy of resistance and revolt that will not be caged into an impossible cage, that of Hegel, but of something completely new that we can imagine, maybe with the help of Irigare and Irigare's reading of Marx, especially in her two books, Speculum and This Sex Which Is Not One. So this was my presentation. I'm on time, right?
Typically, developed inspection of the